I am Ari Shapiro, and you all look nothing like what I imagined either. I believe I may have woken a few of you up in the past, and I apologize. A few of us may have showered together, and it was good for me too. We've just been through this really incredible week in the American story. And while I want to look ahead in this talk today, I think it's also really important to just pause for a moment and look back at where we are this week. I arrived at NPR actually in January of 2001. And my very first assignment as an intern was on Inauguration Day for President George W. Bush. On his first inauguration, I ran bag lunches from NPR headquarters to the parade route where our reporters were stationed. And as I was covering President Obama's second inauguration on Monday, I thought, what a changed America this is, that I couldn't even imagine handing a bag of unknown contents over the security barrier to somebody along the parade route, right? 4 years ago, when it was 20 degrees colder than it was this year, I was on the Mall covering sort of the experience of the people who had come to see President Obama's first inauguration, which was an amazing experience. But it really didn't compare to this year when I woke up before dawn, rode my bike to NPR, it's how I get around everywhere in Washington, met up with my colleagues Steve Inskeep, Scott Horsley, and Audie Cornish, and the four of us tromped down to Capitol Hill together, and we took our seats on the bleachers right overlooking where the president would take the oath of office. And we watched these VIPs walk in as the sun rose over the Capitol, and we watched people come in like John McCain, who had run against President Obama in 2008, and Paul Ryan, who was the Republican vice presidential nominee this year, and many members of the House and Senate who had spent the last 4 years fighting every part of the Obama agenda, who were all there to celebrate as Americans this new chapter. Republican Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee got up and said, a lot of countries have transitions of power with mobs and coups, and we as Americans do not. And we all pause today and we remember this moment. And it was all the more significant because it was Martin Luther King Day, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And we saw Myrlie Evers Williams, 80 years old, the widow of the civil rights icon Medgar Evers, who 50 years ago this year was shot to death in the driveway of his Mississippi home, deliver the invocation. And then, you know, I remembered that 4 years ago, Aretha Franklin sang at President Obama's inauguration. And then this year, Beyonce sang. Well, you know, maybe. Just as a parenthetical, I don't get what the big deal is about Beyonce lip syncing. I mean, 4 years ago, Yo-Yo Ma pretended to play the cello. Nobody gave him a hard time. Give Beyonce a break. My point is, Aretha Franklin was born in 1942 into segregation in Memphis, Tennessee. And 4 years later, the woman who sang at Barack Obama's second inauguration, Beyonce, was born in 1981 into a completely different America. And just to think about the way this country has changed in those 40 years, from Aretha Franklin's birth to Beyonce's birth, it can be so easy, especially covering politics in Washington, to get really negative and bogged down in the daily crises that consume this country. And God knows there are constant daily crises, and those crises are real. But to focus only on those crises loses sight of the extraordinary, incredible, unbelievable progress that this country has made. That was all happening to my left on the bleachers, and to my right, it was a sea of 800,000 people, many of them waving American flags, that from my perch just looked like this shimmering sea. And even for a cynical, jaded political reporter in Washington, I think it would have been difficult for any American of any political background not to feel proud and moved by that moment on Monday. So I wanted to use this opportunity today to look forward at the next 4 years, to co-opt the term that President Obama used in his campaign, and talk about what we might have in store in the second term of an Obama presidency. And when I think about what's going to happen next, the big question is there a chance to accomplish anything in a bipartisan way? And I think back to a moment at the very end of the presidential campaign. And I should pause here, by the way, to say that for the last year, I covered the campaign traveling with Mitt Romney, and your state was a godsend. Because we would be traveling hundreds of miles through snowbound Ohio and frigid New Hampshire and flat, brown, barren Iowa, and then we would come here. And as beautiful as your state is, it's even more beautiful without presidential candidates in it. You know, to turn on the TV and not see a single political ad, it's like, oh. So I think back to the last week of the presidential campaign, and specifically, it was October 29th, 2012. And at this point, we were in the home stretch of this marathon that we had been on every day for more than a year. And I wrote something on Twitter that sort of captured my astonishment at that day. I wrote, quote, "Romney press on a bus in Ohio is dumbfounded that a week before the presidential election, we are on the wrong story." On that day, October 29th, nobody was paying attention to the presidential race, even though the election was 1 week away. People were riveted by images that looked like they had come out of some Hollywood summer blockbuster. Subway stations in New York turning into waterfalls, a construction crane dangling over the streets of Manhattan. Obviously, I'm talking, of course, about Hurricane Sandy. And a couple of days later, Sandy was no longer just a story of man versus nature. A political angle had emerged in the Sandy story. And this was thanks largely, no pun intended, to the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Now, Chris Christie is not just a Republican. He was the keynote speaker at the 2012 Republican convention in Tampa. He was one of Mitt Romney's top surrogates on the campaign trail. He is still described as a frontrunner for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. And Chris Christie, touring the storm damage with President Obama, described the president's efforts as outstanding. He said the administration's response to Sandy was wonderful. And he added, "The president has been all over this and deserves great credit." Some conservatives later said, in what I think was a bit of overstatement, that this may have cost Romney the election. Well, needless to say, in the moment, conservative political commentators were aghast. Rush Limbaugh called Chris Christie a fat fool. The American Spectator magazine was a little more creative. They referred to Christie as the gelatinous clown. But for people who were tired of unending gridlock in Washington, this seemed like something new, like a glimmer of hope. If 1 week before the presidential election, this prominent Republican and the Democratic president that he had opposed so vociferously were able to come together, maybe, in fact, there was hope for bipartisanship after all. And this isn't a crazy idea, because, after all, one of the motivating factors for Republicans of the last 4 years was to make Barack Obama a one-term president, to deny him re-election. I mean, this was something that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said directly to the National Journal. The quote was, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." Well, President Obama is not a one-term president, and he cannot be a three-term president. So, one of the driving motivations of Republicans to block the Obama agenda, to deny him another term in office, is gone. And here's another reason to hope for some bipartisanship. Polls show that the American people are getting tired of extremism. 2 years ago, 41% of Americans viewed the Tea Party favorably. Today, depending on which poll you trust, either 32%, according to ABC News, view the Tea Party favorably. According to Gallup, 25% view the Tea Party favorably. So there's potential here, right? Now, the first big test of whether this potential would become reality was the fiscal cliff right after the election. And as agonizing as it was for people like me to cover the fiscal cliff every day, I'm sure it was almost as agonizing for you to watch the news coverage of it every day. So I'm going to ask you to grit your teeth and bear with me for just a few minutes while we relive it, because I think there are some very important lessons to learn from it. As many of you are probably aware, the fiscal cliff refers to this package of spending cuts and tax increases that would have gone into effect in the new year if Congress didn't act. And all of these were created by Congress. So for example, the Bush tax cuts would all expire, meaning taxes would go up on everyone. The sequester, which is deep cuts in military and discretionary spending, the sequester would go into effect. And by the way, the sequester is 10% cuts that have to be across the board. So if I run the Department of Energy or Education, I can't just say, well, here's a program that costs 10% of our budget, I'll get rid of that program, that meets the sequester. No, the rules are you have to remove 10% of everything, which is no way to run a business or a government or anything else. And that's why it was designed that way, was so that it wouldn't happen. The idea of the fiscal cliff was that it would be this compelling motivation for Congress to come together and get something done because the consequences of not getting something done were so egregious. And there were many, many more elements of the fiscal cliff than that. So at first, things looked pretty good. Right after the election, House Speaker John Boehner agreed to more tax revenues. Not tax rate increases, but getting rid of loopholes and things like that so that there could be more tax money coming into the federal government. It's not what Democrats wanted, but it is a violation of the No New Taxes Grover Norquist pledge. So Republicans were moving a little bit, right? And then Barack Obama, who right after the election said, I will not allow taxes to stay the same for anyone making more than $100,000. Well, he went up to $250,000 and then $400,000. So there was movement, right? And I'm going to describe where things stood a week before Christmas, and I'm going to get a little bit into numbers here, but these are important numbers, so bear with me, all right? 1 week before Christmas, Republicans were asking for $1 trillion in new tax revenue over a decade. Democrats wanted $1.2 trillion in new tax revenue over a decade. In spending cuts, Speaker Boehner wanted around $1 trillion in cuts over a decade. Democrats wanted around $800 billion in spending cuts over a decade. So roughly speaking, the gap between the two sides a week before Christmas was about $400 billion over a decade. Does anyone have any idea how much the government spends in a decade? $40 trillion. So the Democrats and the Republicans were separated by about 1% of federal spending over 10 years. This is nothing, right? Anybody can, like this is not a disagreement. This is like a rounding error, not even. And yet, they couldn't reach an agreement. And part of this was because Boehner offered what he called Plan B. Now, Plan B was his more conservative plan that would allow the Tea Party wing of the Republicans in the House to vote for a more conservative plan. Then Democrats in the Senate could knock it down. Republicans in the House could say, look, we wanted this more conservative thing. We didn't get it, so we have to vote for this less conservative thing that the Democrats in the Senate are going to create, and we'll swallow it for the good of the country. But that's not what happened. Plan B was not conservative enough for Boehner's House Republicans. And so he was sort of humiliated and had to pull Plan B before it even came to a vote. Suddenly, the deal was scuttled. Everybody went home miserable and grumbling. President Obama, a couple days before Christmas, came into the White House briefing room. He looked grim. He said, go home, sing Christmas carols, drink eggnog, and come back ready to make a deal. But when they came back, they weren't ready to make a deal. And at the 11th hour, he called Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner and Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell into the White House. He said, Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, go to the Senate and get this done. Well, McConnell and Reid couldn't get it done. And so at the 11.9th hour, McConnell called his pal Joe Biden, the vice president, and said, I need you to come cut a deal with me. And they cut a deal. And it wasn't much of a deal. It doesn't change the spending curve in the US at all. It doesn't lift the debt ceiling. It doesn't deal with the sequester cuts. It just postponed them for a few months. I mean, it kept us from going over the fiscal cliff, but as bargains go, this was a great big meh. That said, it is important to look at the role that Joe Biden played in this. Joe Biden had spent 36 years in the Senate by the time President Obama took office. President Obama had spent 2. I'm not counting the 2 years he spent on the campaign trail, because he was technically a senator, but he was never in Washington. Joe Biden cut a huge range of deals during his time in the Senate, and he cut deals with people who were his polar political opposite. 2 of the most conservative senators in the history of Congress, Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, both asked Vice President Biden to speak at their memorial services. And Mitch McConnell, too, has been in the Senate for a long time and knows how to get deals done. But I'll tell you, today, fewer than half of the 100 members of the Senate have spent more than 6 years, that's 1 term, in the Senate. There's been wave election after wave election, bringing in a lot of new blood, which can be great in some ways, but it means that the guys who know how to cut a deal, and they were all guys, are gone. I mean, it's extraordinary and wonderful and to be celebrated that the Senate has the largest number of women right now in the nation's history, and I believe everyone hopes that there will be more in the future. But all of this new blood is getting rid of the people who actually know how to get things done. So the question is, why, with so many compelling incentives to solve these big problems and so little space separating the 2 parties, why couldn't they get it done? And a producer for ABC News named Amy Walter wrote a bit of analysis that I thought was useful. Here's what she said. Perhaps it's because I'm parent to a 6-year-old, but the only way to make sense of the fiscal cliff shenanigans is to put it in child-rearing terms, she said. If there's no consequence for bad behavior, then the bad behavior will continue. How many times have you said, if you don't stop this right now, then I'll pull over the car, or you won't get dessert? And if the car doesn't pull over or dessert is still served, the child learns he or she can get away with breaking the rules. In Washington, the only real consequence for bad behavior is losing an election. A frustrated public, a declining Dow, these are not the consequences that will spur either side to action, she wrote. It is only when defeat, real lasting defeat, is felt that compromise will happen. Well, I have some bad news for you. Real lasting defeat is not going to come soon. And there was an interesting study by Nate Silver, who is the statistics election guru at the New York Times. You're all familiar with him, who wrote about the number of swing House districts in the country right now. He said, 20 years ago, 103 members of the House of Representatives were elected from swing districts that sometimes elect Republicans, sometimes elect Democrats. Today, there are 35 such districts. And he writes that the number of landslide districts that overwhelmingly vote Democrat or Republican has roughly doubled. Now think about this. If you are a Republican or a Democrat representing a district that is overwhelmingly red or overwhelmingly blue, there's no chance that somebody from the other party is going to beat you in an election. But if you go to Washington and compromise with somebody of the other party, then there is a very real chance that someone of your own party who is more extreme than you will challenge you in the primary and kick you out of Congress. And so there is so much less incentive in Washington right now for people to compromise than there ever has been before. This trend towards partisanship is also true of Democrats, but it is more true of Republicans for a very specific reason. 2010 was a wave election for Republicans. In state legislatures across the country, Republicans took control. They took the majority. Coincidentally, 2010 was also a redistricting year, when the lines get redrawn for congressional boundaries. And so today, the congressional boundaries that were drawn by overwhelmingly Republican legislatures in 2010 overwhelmingly favor Republicans. So much so that in 2012, Americans cast 1 million more votes for Democrats in the House than they cast for Republicans in the House, but Republicans still held control of the House by a margin of 33 seats. The Senate has seen a similar shift, but for different reasons. The National Journal wrote about this, and my head fell open when I read this. Last year, they did a list of the most centrist members of the Senate. And I'm going to go through this list for you. Okay, first up, Scott Brown, Republican of Massachusetts. Anybody know where he is today? He lost his 2012 election to a liberal Democrat. Next on the list, Joe Lieberman, independent of Connecticut, who caucused with the Democrats. Where's Joe Lieberman today? Retired in 2012. Next on the list, Ben Nelson, Democrat of Nebraska. Anyone? Gone, retired in 2012. Olympia Snowe, Republican of Maine. Say it with me. Gone, retired in 2012. One moderate member of the Senate after another has retired, and it's not just this past year. It's been happening for several cycles, and it has a snowball effect. As moderates leave, the Senate becomes a less welcoming place for moderates. Few moderates want to run, and more moderates decide to leave. So, in light of all of this partisan bad news, why do I still believe there's a chance for bipartisanship in Congress? Well, part of it has to do with demographics in the 2012 elections. One of my colleagues described to me being at the Iowa State Fair with a Republican political candidate. And she was sitting on, I don't know, like probably the back of a flatbed truck or something, eating a fried pork chop on a stick because that's all anybody does at the Iowa State Fair. It's actually a great place. If you've never been, it's sort of a life experience that you should have. Deep fried butter. I mean, really. So she's sitting with this candidate on the back of this flatbed truck eating her fried pork chop on a stick, and the guy says to her, look around you. This is the real America. And she said to him, no, this isn't the real America. The real America is Chicago and Los Angeles, and the real America is communities in Iowa and Missouri that are now majority Hispanic because people are working in fields and meat processing plants. America gets 2% less white every 4 years. And that has profound political implications. And it's really scary for the Republican Party because every Republican who has won national office in recent memory has done it by carrying a majority of older white men. So let's do a little comparison of the last time a Republican won a presidential race, 2004, George W. Bush, and the last time a Democrat won the presidential race, just this past year with Barack Obama, all right? 2004, George W. Bush carried 55% of men. His opponent, John Kerry, won 51% of women. Kerry overwhelmingly carried African Americans, Latinos, Asian American voters. Bush was the overwhelming winner among white voters. Kerry won with all voters under age 30. Bush won with all voters over age 30. So Bush was reelected by carrying voters who were white, male, and older. Let's compare that to this year. Romney won 52% of male voters this year, a majority. Obama won 55% of women. Romney won 59% of white voters. Obama carried huge majorities among voters of color. Obama carried all the voting age groups under age 45. Romney carried all the voting age groups over age 45. So the pattern is the same. Republicans carried voters who were white, older, and male. Democrats carried voters who were younger, minorities, and female. And the challenge for Republicans is that America is getting browner every day. The census forecasts that by 2043, America will be a majority-minority nation. No one minority group will outnumber white people, but white people collectively will be smaller than collectively people who are not white. So on election night, Bill O'Reilly said on Fox, the white establishment is now the minority. And I think that's premature, but I also think the trend lines are clear. And what's interesting is that both candidates acknowledged this when they thought they weren't speaking publicly. Mitt Romney's notorious 47% video in which he was privately recorded at a fundraiser, secretly recorded at a private fundraiser, made headlines because he dismissed half the electorate.